Hi, everyone. So today we are going to be talking about ancient Rome and their social hierarchy, as well as slavery within ancient Rome. Now, this is week 6 of our virtual learning experience. And after this video, I will also be filming an instruction video for the assignment this week. So without further ado, I'm going to present my screen and we will get started. Okay, so I'm going to share this. Actually, sorry. Reboot. Whoops, my bad. I meant I was going to present this, but before I do that, I want to take you to a couple of different links on this Google Slides. So the first link is right here, and this is our note-taking sheet. So I've linked a Google Doc for you right here that looks like this. And basically what you're going to do is while I'm talking, while I'm going through these main levels on the social hierarchy, I want you to write a few notes down for each of them. This doesn't have to be complete sentences. It doesn't have to be anything over the top crazy. I don't want you copying and pasting the information from what I've wrote on the Google Slides. I want you to kind of take what I say, summarize it in a few short words, and then write what you come up with underneath each of these. Now, the reason I have some of them highlighted is because those are the most important ones that you need to know. Those are terms that you're going to hear and that you need to know what they mean. The other ones are just part of their social hierarchy, but they aren't as important for you to know. But I just thought I would give you all of that information so you have it. We've talked about it. You have an idea about it. And if you hear about it or see a test question about it somewhere down the road, you'll have an idea, hopefully, of what these words mean. When you finish your note-taking sheet, I've included my email right here, and I would love it if you share your note-taking sheet with me so I can see the work that you're doing and the progress that you are making. So there's that. I also down here have a video linked, and after I go through this, if you're still confused on the difference between patricians and plebeians, this video right here will hopefully help clarify some things and make it seem a little bit more easier or manageable to work with. So those are those two links. Now I'm going to present and we're going to get started here. So, social hierarchy of the Roman Empire. Now, when we were in class together, we were talking about social hierarchies. That should not be a term that you don't know what it means. Social hierarchy, remember when we were talking about it with ancient civilizations like Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, ancient India, ancient China, typically we had our ruler up at the top. Whether it was a king, whether it was a queen, emperor, whatever, whoever it was, they were at the top. Below them typically came your royal family, obviously, priests, soldiers. Those types of people were regarded more highly in society. So they were near the top. Below them were people that were skilled laborers. They might be your merchants, your blacksmiths, your traders, things that require a little bit more skill to do. Underneath those would be your unskilled laborers. So maybe a construction worker or a farmer. Those types of things would be underneath of those. And then finally, at the very bottom in society are your servants and your slaves. So those are the typical social hierarchies that we're used to seeing. Now, ancient Rome has a couple more divisions of labor on here. However, we still see some similarities. So the emperor is still at the top. That's something that is not new to us. It's one person. They have this sole power. They're at the top. Below them, we have patricians and senators, and I'll talk more about those in a little bit. Then we have equestrians. Plebeians are down here. Freedmen and soldiers. So soldiers being near the bottom, that's a new experience or new topic for us. And then finally, we have slaves, and that again should not be new. So I'm going to go into detail about who these people are and some important things that you should know about them. So make sure as I go through these, you're copying down some notes and summarizing those key points in your note-taking sheet, which again can be found here. So first up is the emperor. And the emperor of Rome is this almighty guy. It's always a man, for one thing. He typically lives in the best house. He eats the best food. He wears the most extravagant clothes, jewelry, whatever. He looks like a rich guy. Not only does he outwardly look like an emperor or look like a wealthy person, he also has a lot of power and authority within the empire. He is the one that is kind of dictating what is happening within the empire. Now, in his free time, he's doing a lot of educational type things because if you lived in ancient Rome, typically only the most wealthy people were educated, and those typically were males. So, some of his pastimes, music, poetry, hunting, horse racing, all of those things are things the emperor would do or the royal family would do. Now, emperors were not chosen because they were super smart or because they were the best fighter or because they were an exceptional writer. Emperors were chosen based on family lines. So, if you were in the royal family, let's say you were born, you were first off, a male, has to be a male. If you were in that royal family, you typically, once your dad dies and you were a boy, you would eventually take over that emperor position. Now, it didn't always work this way. Sometimes they didn't have male heirs. So they would go to brothers of the emperor, or maybe stepsons, or maybe even a friend. Okay, so it can sway a little bit, but it is in some way a relation to the emperor himself. It stays within that family line. Now, this does cause a little bit of problems if, first, let's say you have a friend that takes over. It's kind of like, who's to say that that friend gets to be the next emperor? But for the most part, it stays within that same family line, and it just keeps happening throughout history. Now, all emperors do have to be approved by the Senate, and I'll get to that in a second. Before I do that, down here, I have attached an article on the emperor. So if you click on this, it'll take you, oops, because I'm in present mode, it won't work. Let me escape out of here. It'll take you to a PDF version of an article. It's one page. It's very short. It kind of just gives a little bit more detail as to what I was saying in the slides. Says pretty much the same thing. One difference is it's going to talk about slavery and how the emperor viewed slavery. And really, the emperor wanted to keep slavery because he benefited from it. He had slaves doing his work. He had slaves as bodyguards. He benefited from slavery greatly and did not want to change that. He believed it was needed, and he did everything to kind of keep that system moving forward. So if you want to look at that, it's there. It's available for you. I just wanted to show you that. So beneath the emperor in this social pyramid is patricians. And patricians are a wealthy group of people. They are kind of like your aristocratic group in the Roman Empire. And these people are also very educated, just like the emperor. The males in this group, in this social class, were able to be educated. And therefore, they took the reins or the title of political leadership, religious leadership, military leadership. They were the people in charge within the Roman Empire, within society. They were the ones that were kind of telling other people of the lower social classes what to do. Now, they were wealthy, like I said before, and this comes from old wealth. It doesn't all of a sudden just come up, oh, I made a whole bunch of money on this one deal, I'm now a patrician. It doesn't work like that. These people come from early on in the empire when the aristocrats were taking in all this land and they were making lots of money that way. It's those family lines that keep continuing to have that large amount of wealth. Those are your patrician class. Now, typically, down here I have educated again, like I said before. They're in leadership. They learn poetry and literature, history, geography. They have a lot more opportunities to advance themselves education-wise compared to lower social classes. Now, it says they had special privileges as well. They did not have to serve in the military. And we'll get to that in a little bit, but the Roman military was a huge part of the empire's success, and the patricians did not have to serve, whereas other people did. And down here, I have another article on the patricians. I'm not going to click on it. If you would like to see a little bit more details on them and how they viewed slavery, that is there for you to look through. So we have emperors, then we have patricians, now we have senators. A senator is kind of on the same level as a patrician because to be a senator, you have to be a patrician. So senators are patricians. They're just a certain type of patrician, if that makes sense. It is an advisory council right here filled entirely with patricians. By the last 2 centuries, though, so in the beginning, senators, they had a lot of power in ancient Rome. They had a lot of the governing force. They were imposing taxes, making laws, deciding what buildings were to be built, all of that kind of stuff. However, as ancient Rome went on, as the empire grew older, these senators were just kind of like a public figure. They didn't have a lot of political power. They lost a lot of say in what was happening in ancient Rome. And they were just kind of like a figurehead for the Roman Empire. They did keep some political power. I'm not saying that they were just there for show, but they did lose a lot of that political power as the empire grew older, as the empire went on. They did decide, though, who the emperor was going to be. That was one thing that kind of stayed true with the senators. They did have the final say in who the emperor was going to be. They voted yes or no. And that's pretty much them. So equestrians. So we had emperor, then patricians / senators, and now we're at equestrians. This is the next level down. They're ranked below senators and patricians. Now, equestrians is probably a word you may have heard of. You probably don't know what it is. But equestrians, the word itself comes from horses. When I think of equestrians, I think of horses or horse racing or horse riders. And that's where this word does come from, because these people that are in this class were part of the Roman cavalry in the beginning. However, as time went on, that changes a little bit. And they take on more of a business role within the empire. Now, when I think of equestrians, I think of someone who is kind of like the middleman between the wealthy and between the poor. They are like this middle class, middle of the road type of people. They're the ones that are trying to smooth out any issues with the working class or the lower class. And they're also the ones that are communicating with the patricians and with the senators about what is happening in the empire. They're kind of like your human resource people. They're your schmoozers. They're the ones that are trying to keep everyone happy. And typically their role in society is tax collectors, bankers, miners, exporters. They manage a lot of things, a lot of projects like construction, road building. So they're the ones that are managing the poor people or the working class, but they're not up on the same level as the patricians and the senators. They work for them or they communicate with them. Now, even if they become very wealthy, they can never be part of the patrician class. This is the highest they can go. They can never be part of the Senate. They have to stay at this equestrian level. So there was limited mobility for them in moving up in the social hierarchy. Okay, so we've talked about emperors, they're at the top. We've talked about patricians and senators, they're the next level, and they are your rich, they're your wealthy. We've talked about equestrians, they're like your middleman. And now we're at plebeians. And plebeians are the working class, they're your poor people. They make up a large majority of the Roman Empire. They don't have a lot of individual power, they don't have a lot of say in the government's doing or the roles or the laws that they're imposing on the people. They just kind of go to work, they pay their taxes, they do what they're supposed to as a citizen, and as long as they're kept happy, they're going to keep doing that. Now, because they're so large, though, they have to be kept happy. The emperor has to keep them happy because what they could do is if they are unhappy, a lot of them are angry, mad, upset at what the emperor is doing, they can come together and rebel against the emperor. So the emperor has to keep these people happy and they have to be handled carefully. If not, things could turn ugly. So they honestly, it just kind of reminds me when I think of plebeians, it just kind of reminds me of us, right? We come to work, we do what we're supposed to do, we pay our taxes to the government, and we're on our way. That's just our life sequence or daily life experience. Plebeians cannot be a patrician. They cannot be part of the equestrian class. They are a plebeian. And down here it has some of the jobs. Farmers, bakers, builders, craftsmen, people that worked hard to support their family and pay their taxes. So that's kind of where I think of us, just the average everyday person. So, really, main thing, they're the working class, below patricians, below equestrians. Down here is an article on the plebeians. And again, it's short, one page, summarizes this information, and also talks about how they viewed slavery. Okay, we're about halfway done here. So, underneath plebeians are freedmen. And something to know about the Roman Empire is they have slaves, obviously, but those slaves can eventually become free. Whether they buy their freedom, whether their slave owners grant them freedom, freed slaves are called freedmen. So, a freedman is a freed slave. They were once in slavery, they got out of slavery, now they're a freedman. These freedmen kind of go with plebeians because they're going to work the same jobs as a plebeian does. They're going to be a craftsman, a farmer, a baker. On here it says midwives, traders. And so they're going to work day to day just like a plebeian does. They live a pretty similar life as to a plebeian. And some even do become wealthy. They get out of slavery, they work, they pay their taxes, they do their duties as a citizen, and eventually some do become pretty wealthy or live pretty lavishly. Now, just because they get out of slavery and they have a good job, they become wealthy, does not mean that they are viewed the same as a plebeian. Freedmen typically have these stereotypes against them because they were a slave at one time. They usually couldn't overcome that. People were very mean to them. They looked down on them. They didn't see them as being equal. Even if one was more wealthy than you, they still said, oh, no, you were once a slave. You're not the same as me. You don't get to be on my level. So freedmen were, for the large part, treated very poorly and looked down upon by the rest of Roman society. Almost done here. So, soldiers are next, and soldiers are really important in Roman society because they are a huge part of why the Roman Empire became so big. This army was extremely skilled in fighting. They had discipline, they had stamina, they trained a lot. If you were in the army, you had to serve a minimum term of 20 years. And think about it in today's terms, typically soldiers that enlist in the military, they have to serve a term of 4 years at a minimum. They can re-enlist, obviously, and serve longer if they want to, but that minimum is typically 4 years. In the Roman Empire, though, that minimum was 20 years. So they're constantly fighting, constantly training, constantly practicing for war. So they become very good at it, very skilled. And that in turn helps this empire grow to be very large because they do go to war with a lot of neighboring areas and take those territories into their own. So, Roman army, very important. They were very successful. They were important to the emperor, and that's all you need to know about them. Now, women is not on your sheet. However, I just wanted to talk briefly about women in the Roman Empire because they are treated very differently than males. So, women were defined by the men in their lives. If you were a mother or a wife or whatever, daughter, you had to submit to your husband. Whatever he said, that's how it went. You couldn't argue with them. You couldn't say, oh, I think we should do something this way. It was whatever your husband wanted you to do, that is what you were going to do. As a woman, your primary goal in life was to raise children, was to care for your husband, and do typical housework, house chores, all that stuff. You were not educated, and if you were, you had to be from a wealthy class. Everyday women were not educated. And if you were from an upper class, you were typically only in school for a few years. Most women could not read, they could not write, and therefore we don't have a lot of records from women during this time period because they weren't telling their stories. It was men that told the stories for the women. So we have a hard time understanding what the true experience of a woman in the Roman Empire, what her life was like, because there aren't those primary sources. So if you were a woman in the Roman Empire, you pretty much had no rights. You weren't really considered a citizen. You submit to your husband, to your mother, and that's just how it went for you. You didn't have very many legal rights. You couldn't read. You couldn't write. Life was about caring for others. Okay, so slaves, I am going to come back to. I have one other thing that I want to talk to you about first. Gladiators. And gladiators are not on your note-taking sheet either, but gladiators are a part of the slave class. So I want to speak to them first, then I'll go back to slaves, and we'll be good for today's lecture. So a gladiator is part of the slave class. Slaves, there's a lot of slaves in the Roman Empire. You'll see in the article that we're going to read, 35% of people are slaves. So gladiators is one part of that slaving class. And gladiators are the entertainment for the Roman Empire. They are the movie stars of the Roman Empire. Basically, what a gladiator was is a slave, obviously, who would be put into this amphitheater, and they would have to fight to the death with another gladiator. And you would have all the Roman citizens coming to this amphitheater to watch, to cheer, to be excited. It was like going to the movies or going to a concert in today's terms. You have all these people coming together to watch this one thing out of enjoyment. But for them, this enjoyment came at the death of another person. They were bloody, they were brutal, they were often seen as this dark side of Roman civilization, but they were very popular. Lots of people came to them. Typically, you would have these gladiators fighting. As time went on, though, they got more serious about it, tried to make it more into a spectacle. They would throw lions in, tigers, whatever animals, wild animals in these gladiator matches, and these gladiators had to become more specialized. So they became more specialized in fighting other humans. So crazy stuff. Now let's talk about the slaves. And the slaves, I have two different articles. We're only going to talk about this first article right here. And this is uploaded to Edgy. And Edgy is a cool resource because it allows you to annotate digitally or virtually. You can highlight something and then make a comment about that. Or you can ask a question. Maybe you don't understand what that word is saying. So for example, right here, I highlighted aristocrats. And if I click on my name or just even hover over it, it says, what does aristocrats mean? So that right there is a comment. And I, as a teacher, can see that comment that you made and be able to answer that question for you. So why it said, why would they just show them off and not make, hold on, I got to click on it, and not make money. So as we get through this, I'll be able to reply to this comment and hopefully answer this question for him. So this is all about slavery in the Roman Empire. It says, in the 3rd century BCE, with the wars of conquest, Rome became a large-scale slave society. Many common citizens lost their farmland because they were away for extended periods of fighting in the Roman army. Aristocrats then brought up this farmland with the profits they made from war. The problem was that they then needed a lot more workers to farm the land. Free citizens were needed by the army, plus they did not want to work for the aristocrats. Aristocrats chose to use slaves to work the farmland. It is hard to know how many slaves there were in imperial Rome. Scholars using a variety of methods have estimated that up to 35% of the total population in the 1st century CE were slaves. Compare that to estimates of slavery in ancient Egypt, where the slave population never rose above 10%. So a couple of key things right here. First off, Rome became a slave society because in the beginning, these poor working class people had to go off and fight in the Roman army. They had to go off and fight to war. Now, if they owned land, that land was then snatched up or taken away by the aristocrats, by the wealthy people in Roman society. So these aristocrats then have these huge masses of land, and they don't have enough people to work for them to be able to make a profit on all this land. So what they would do then is when those Roman soldiers came back is they would put them into slavery for working those fields. Also, any captives from war, let's say, that were taken from other areas, they would bring them back and enslave them and make them work on these wealthy aristocratic plantations or huge farm fields. So that's a little bit about how the Roman army, or not the Roman army, sorry, the Roman Empire got slaves. Now, when you think about it, 35% of their population was enslaved. That's a huge number. 1/3 is 33.3%. So we're above a third of the population. So that means every 3 people, one of them was enslaved. That's a very big number. When we look at ancient Egypt, they had below 10%. So, and slavery in ancient Egypt, they're the ones that built the pyramids. They built all these huge monumental structures. But Roman Empire had way more. So war was a common source of slaves because the winner in a war could take some or all the enemy captive. As agriculture increased in the 3rd century BCE in Rome, so did the demand for slaves. At this point, Romans began to enslave and sell many more of their war captives. Slaves were bought at slave markets and could even be rented for periods of time. The Romans did not depend only on war as a source of slaves. New slaves were also obtained when the existing slaves had children, piracy, kidnapping, abandoned babies, and the sale of one's children or of oneself. So what would happen is not only were captives in war turned to slaves, but slaves were also obtained when slaves had children, piracy, if you had a ship and you were out sailing and you saw another ship and you attacked it and won, you could take those people and enslave them. Kidnapping, Abandoned baby. So sometimes parents couldn't care for a child and they would abandon it. That abandoned baby would then be raised into slavery. Or the sale of one's children or of oneself. Basically, what that means is maybe you couldn't pay your taxes. You didn't have enough money to feed your family. So what would happen is typically the wife would sell herself into slavery, or they would sell one of their children into slavery to pay off those debts. So right here, wealthy Romans owned hundreds or thousands of slaves, but even the average person could only own a few. The Roman government even owned slaves and forced them to work in such jobs as mining for precious metals, building roads and bridges, and as executioners. Some masters made a lot of money from the labor of their slaves. The slaves who were profitable to their owners did jobs like farming, unskilled labor, such as digging or moving, and skilled labor, such as carpentry and weaving. On the other hand, some masters owned slaves that did not actually make a profit for the master. These masters only owned slaves to serve them in their homes and to show off their wealth. Some people were so dependent on their slaves that they did not even dress themselves. They had a slave do it for them. The slaves who were not profitable to their masters were nannies, housekeepers, dancers, cooks, laundry women, personal body slaves, meaning with the master at all times. So, those are some of the jobs these slaves did. Some were profitable. Some were just kind of there for show. They were like, these rich people were like, oh my gosh, look at me. I've got all these slaves. I don't have to do anything for myself. It was kind of like showing off. The lives that slaves led differed greatly depending on who owned them and what kind of work they did. Some owners felt affection for their slaves and treated them humanely. Perhaps they also thought it was a good idea to take care of their investment. Sometimes slaves were put into trusted positions like accountants or advisors. However, most slaves led very difficult lives. Some owners abused their slaves by beating them, torturing them, and even killing them. It is known that many abused slaves reacted against their masters by running away. Runaway slaves, if caught, were whipped, branded with iron, or even killed. Some slaves killed their masters or started a rebellion, as in the case of Spartacus. So we see kind of some similarities, really, between ancient Rome and their slaves and how they were treated compared to the U.S. and our history and how we treated slaves. In some plantations, those slaves were treated more humanely. They were fed more. They were cared for more. However, in some plantations, we see the complete opposite in America. We see slaves being whipped, slaves being tortured, being barely fed, forced to work ungodly amount of hours in the fields. So we see those differences. Slaves also tried to run away in the US, and if they were caught, typically they were whipped, again tortured, sometimes even killed. Sometimes they would send dogs to go chase down these slaves and then rip them to shreds, but not kill them. So we see lots of different similarities between what was happening in slavery in the Roman Empire thousands of years ago and slavery in the Americas that was only 100 years ago. Or hundreds, sorry. So, finally, this last section, there never was an attempt to legally abolish slavery in Rome, but it is known that Rome was unique among slave-owning societies in that slaves were regularly freed. When a slave was informally freed, he or she did not become Roman citizens and could not own property or wealth. When a slave was formally freed, he or she became a Roman citizen. However, ex-slaves could not hold public office and faced discrimination. In theory, a freed man or freed woman's child had the same opportunities as other freeborn citizens. So right there, we see that this ability that slaves could be freed. Whether it's formally or informally, they could be freed. However, if they were freed, they still faced stereotypes, persecution, all that stuff from just being labeled as a slave in their past. So that's a little bit about slavery. If you take a few things, put it on the note sheet, kind of summarize some of these topics about slavery, that'll be good. That is the end of my presentation. I'm going to make another video here in a little bit and post it to Google Classroom that explains the assignment for the week. And I wanted to make sure that this was separate so kids could go back and look at just that if they needed extra help. Now, quick reminder, up at the top, note-taking sheet is right there. This video on patricians and plebeians is linked as well if you wanted extra help or needed more information on them. So with that, I'm going to end this video. If you have any questions, you can always email me. And if you share that note-taking sheet, I would really appreciate it. I'll give you some feedback and help you out. These are terms that you definitely need to know going into 8th grade next year, especially as you prepare for the M step. So that's all I have for you, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye.